April 17, 1945. The small Bavarian town of Eisenbach lay shrouded in morning mist as American forces from the 45th Infantry Division moved cautiously through its cobblestone streets. Medical Sergeant Thomas Aldridge of the 114th Medical Battalion had seen many liberated towns in his 11 months in Europe, but something about this one felt different. The townspeople watched from windows with a mixture of fear and relief that would soon give way to something far more complicated. They believed the worst was over, but for Aldridge and one particular young German nurse, the most extraordinary chapter of their lives was about to begin. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true story of how a chance encounter during the final days of the European conflict would transcend national boundaries, challenge everything two people thought they knew about their enemies, and ultimately demonstrate how the smallest acts of compassion can echo across years of silence and confusion. The morning had started like many others for Sergeant Thomas Aldridge. At 27 years old, with wavy brown hair beginning to thin at the temples and deep-set grey eyes that had seen too much suffering, he had the worn look of a man twice his age. His uniform, once crisp and regulation perfect, now hung loosely on his thinning frame. Aldridge had trained as a pharmacist in Baltimore before the war, and his measured, methodical approach to medicine had served him well in the chaos of the European theatre. "We're setting up an aid station in that church," Captain Reynolds said, pointing to a small stone building with a crooked spire that rose above the modest skyline of Eisenbach. "Intelligence says the Germans cleared out 2 days ago, but expect stragglers and civilians in need of care." Aldridge nodded, adjusting the medical kit slung over his shoulder. It contained 37 morphine syrettes, 22 packets of sulfur powder, 46 bandages of various sizes, and 16 tourniquets. He had counted them obsessively that morning, as he did every morning. His unit had treated 873 American casualties since landing in Italy, and Aldridge had personally saved 162 lives by his captain's estimation. Numbers gave him comfort in a world where little else made sense. "Davis, Mitchell, you're with Aldridge," Captain Reynolds continued, addressing 2 young medics who had joined the unit as replacements just 3 weeks earlier. "Check the church, set up triage, and report back when you're operational." The 3 medics made their way down the narrow street. The buildings of Eisenbach were a mix of traditional Bavarian architecture, with steep roofs and painted shutters, many now hanging askew or shattered from artillery blasts. Most windows were covered with whatever materials the residents could find: cloth, paper, thin pieces of wood, to replace glass long since blown out. The sweet, sickly odor of decay mingled with wood smoke and the lingering chemical smell of explosives. It was a scent profile Aldridge had come to associate with newly liberated areas. "You think there'll be any resistance here?" asked Private Mitchell, a freckle-faced 19-year-old from Oregon who still flinched at sudden noises. "Doubtful," Aldridge replied, "but keep your eyes open. The desperate ones are the dangerous ones." As they approached the church, Aldridge noticed something unusual: fresh footprints in the mud leading to a side entrance, too small to be from military boots. The church itself was a modest structure dating back hundreds of years, its stone facade pitted and scarred by the recent fighting. The wooden door to the side entrance was slightly ajar. "Wait here," Aldridge instructed the younger medics, drawing his sidearm, a Colt .45 automatic that he had fired exactly twice in combat, both times into the air as warnings. He pushed the door open slowly with his foot, wincing at the loud creak of ancient hinges. The interior was cool and dim, with dust motes dancing in the shafts of colored light that streamed through stained glass windows depicting saints and martyrs. Most of the wooden pews had been pushed to the sides, creating a large open space in the nave. And there, kneeling beside a prone figure on the stone floor, was a young woman. She wore a grey dress with a white apron, both stained with what appeared to be blood and dirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a loose bun, with stray strands falling across her face as she worked. She looked up at the sound of the door, her blue eyes widening with fear when she saw Aldridge and his weapon. In that instant, several things became clear to him. She was caring for a wounded person. She was terrified. and she was too young to bear the weight of responsibility that was evident in her exhausted posture. "Medic," Aldridge said, holstering his weapon and pointing to the red cross on his helmet. "Doctor," he added, using one of the few German words he knew. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, but wariness remained in her eyes. She gestured to the person on the floor, an elderly man with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his chest. "Help," she said in heavily accented English. "Please." Aldridge approached cautiously, kneeling opposite the woman. The elderly man's breathing was labored, and when Aldridge gently removed the bandage, he found a deep laceration across the chest, likely from shrapnel. It was infected, with angry red streaks spreading from the wound. "Davis, Mitchell, get in here," Aldridge called. "Bring the full kit." The two young medics rushed in, their expressions shifting from anxiety to professionalism when they saw the wounded civilian. Within minutes they had set up a triage area, laying out antiseptics, bandages, and medications on a clean cloth spread across a pew. As Aldridge cleaned the wound, he observed the young German woman assisting without being asked, anticipating his needs with the practiced efficiency of a trained nurse. She handed him gauze, held the antiseptic bottle, and spoke soothingly to the elderly patient in German. "You nurse?" Aldridge asked between procedures. She nodded. "Krankenschwester. Nurse, yes, Elizabeth." "Thomas," he replied, tapping his chest. "Your patient." "My grandfather," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, with visible effort to form the English words, 3 days. No medicine. Aldridge worked methodically, cleaning the wound, applying sulfur powder, and fashioning a proper bandage. The old man's breathing remained labored but grew steadier as the procedure progressed. When Aldridge finally administered a carefully measured dose of morphine, the relief in the elderly man's face was immediate and profound. "He will need more care," Aldridge explained, using simple words and gestures. "Infection. Bad. We take to aid station when ready." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Thank you," she said. Then, looking around nervously, she added, "Others. There are others." That was how Sergeant Thomas Aldridge discovered that the church basement had been converted into a makeshift hospital, where Elizabeth Hoffman had been caring for 7 wounded civilians, elderly residents who couldn't or wouldn't evacuate, and who had been caught in the crossfire during the American advance. With minimal supplies, and only her nursing training to guide her, she had kept them alive for days as the front lines swept over Eisenbach. What was meant to be a simple aid station setup became a full-scale medical operation. Captain Reynolds eventually arrived with the rest of the medical team, and the church was transformed into an official treatment center for both American personnel and German civilians. Elizabeth's knowledge proved invaluable. She knew each patient's condition, what treatments had been attempted, and which local herbs she had used when conventional medicines ran out. The atmosphere was tense at first. American medics working alongside a German nurse was unprecedented in the experience of everyone present. But medical necessity transcended national boundaries, and by the end of that first day, Elizabeth was being treated as an essential member of the team. She trained at the University Hospital in Munich, Captain Reynolds told Aldridge that evening, as they took inventory of their supplies. Graduated top of her class in 41, then worked in field hospitals, until she came home to care for her grandfather last winter. She's probably seen as much combat medicine as any of us. Aldridge was only half listening, his attention focused on Elizabeth as she moved from patient to patient, checking bandages and offering words of comfort. There was something about her quiet efficiency and gentle manner that commanded respect. The next few days fell into a pattern. Each morning, Aldridge and Elizabeth would make rounds together, their communication improving as she remembered more English, and he picked up German medical terms. They worked side by side, treating the steady stream of patients, American soldiers with minor injuries, civilians suffering from malnutrition and exposure, and occasionally wounded German soldiers who had been left behind during the retreat. It was during the treatment of one such German soldier that Aldridge first witnessed Elizabeth's extraordinary compassion. The man was young, perhaps 20, with shrapnel wounds to his leg and shoulder. He was also a dedicated member of the regime, and made his contempt for Americans clear despite his vulnerable position. "He says you are barbarians," Elizabeth translated reluctantly after the soldier's angry outburst. "He says other things I will not translate." Aldridge continued cleaning the soldier's wounds without comment. When he noticed the young man's watch, a fine Swiss timepiece that seemed out of place on a regular infantry soldier, he raised an eyebrow. The German soldier followed his gaze and sneered. "Juden," he said, tapping the watch. Elizabeth's face hardened. For the first time, Aldridge saw anger flash in her blue eyes. She said something in rapid German that made the soldier look away in shame. "What did you tell him?" Aldridge asked when they had finished the treatment and moved to the next patient. "That my friend Ruth wore a watch like that," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Before they took her away to the camps. That if he is proud of such things, he deserves neither your care nor my translation." Aldridge was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your friend," he finally said. Elizabeth nodded, her expression distant. There is much to be sorry for on all sides. That evening, as spring rain pattered against the stained glass windows, Aldridge found Elizabeth sitting alone in a pew, her head bowed not in prayer, but in exhaustion. He sat beside her, offering a mug of coffee, a luxury he had saved from his ration. "You should rest," he said. "I have been working for 16 hours straight." She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "So have you." They sat in companionable silence, the kind that develops between people who have worked together under pressure. Around them, the church was relatively quiet. Most patients were sleeping, their breathing creating a gentle backdrop of human presence. "Tell me about Baltimore," Elizabeth said suddenly. "Is it beautiful?" Aldridge smiled, surprised by the question. "Parts of it. There's a harbor, ships coming and going, good crab cakes. That's a food you'd probably like. But it's not as pretty as here. Bavaria, I mean, when it's not." He gestured vaguely to indicate the destruction around them. "I have never seen the ocean," she said wistfully. "I always wanted to travel. Before. Before. That simple word contained so much. Before the war, before the world changed, before they found themselves sitting together in a bombed-out church, enemies by circumstance and allies by choice. "You will," Aldridge said with more confidence than he felt. "This will end. People will travel again." Elizabeth's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Some things end. Other things never do." The following morning brought new challenges. A convoy of American trucks arrived carrying 23 wounded soldiers from a skirmish with German forces retreating toward the Alps. The church aid station quickly reached capacity, with patients lying on pews and floor space, as medics worked frantically to stabilize the most critical cases. Aldridge and Elizabeth found themselves working on a sergeant with a chest wound that bubbled with each labored breath, a sucking chest wound that would be fatal without immediate intervention. They moved in perfect synchronization, Aldridge creating an improvised seal while Elizabeth monitored vital signs and administered plasma. "Pressure dropping," she reported, her accent nearly invisible in the focus of the moment. "I see it," Aldridge responded, working faster. "Hand me the forceps and another pack of gauze." The wounded sergeant, barely conscious, looked up at Elizabeth with confusion. "Nurse?" he mumbled. "You don't sound American." "She's with us," Aldridge said firmly. "Best damn nurse in Bavaria. Now, lie still." The operation succeeded, and as they moved to the next patient, Aldridge noticed Elizabeth watching him with an unreadable expression. "What?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "You defended me," she said simply. "You did not have to do that." Aldridge shrugged. "We're on the same side in here." Her smile was sad. "In here, yes. But outside those doors?" The question hung between them, impossible to answer. By the 5th day, the situation in Eisenbach had stabilized. Most of the American wounded had been evacuated to larger facilities, leaving primarily civilian patients in the church aid station. Aldridge was updating medical records when Captain Reynolds approached with a grim expression. "Orders just came through," Reynolds said quietly. "Division's moving out tomorrow morning. We're heading east to link up with the Russians." Aldridge nodded, having expected this development. What about the aid station? We'll leave supplies and 2 medics until relief arrives. Should be less than 48 hours. Reynolds hesitated. There's something else you should know. Military government detachment is coming in with us. They'll be handling civilian affairs, including, well, denazification procedures. The implication was clear. All German officials, including medical personnel, would be subject to screening. Those with connections to the regime would face consequences ranging from restrictions on their professional activities to criminal charges. Elizabeth isn't a party member, Aldridge said immediately. She's been helping us, saving our men. Reynolds held up a hand. I know that, and I'll note it in my report. But it won't be up to us. That night, Aldridge found himself unable to sleep, turning the situation over in his mind. Elizabeth had become more than just a capable colleague. She represented something he hadn't expected to find in enemy territory. A reminder that humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries of nations at war. The thought of her facing interrogation, possibly restrictions or worse, was deeply troubling. He found her in the church garden just before dawn, gathering herbs that she had been using to supplement their dwindling medical supplies. The eastern sky was beginning to brighten, painting the broken town in gentle pink light that belied the destruction around them. "We're moving out today," he said without preamble. Elizabeth straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "I know. Your captain told me yesterday. Military government is coming in. They'll be asking questions about everyone's activities during the war." She nodded, her expression composed. "That is to be expected. I've written a letter," Aldridge continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, "explaining how you've helped, treated our wounded. Captain Reynolds signed it too." Elizabeth took the letter, glancing at it briefly before tucking it into her apron pocket. "Thank you, that is kind. It's just the truth," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Listen, when this is all sorted out, if you wanted to continue your medical training, I have connections at Johns Hopkins. It's a hospital in Baltimore, one of the best in the world. I could write to them." The offer hung in the air between them, representing possibilities neither had dared consider. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly, but then her expression shuttered closed. "That is very kind," she repeated. "But I think there will be much rebuilding to do here. My people will need nurses." Aldridge nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "Of course, I just thought." "In another time, another world," she said softly, touching his arm briefly. "But we must live in this one." The church bells rang 6 times, signaling the hour. The sound seemed to break the moment between them. Elizabeth withdrew her hand and looked toward the church. "I should check on my grandfather. His fever returned last night." "I'll come with you," Aldridge offered. "We can try the new penicillin that came in yesterday." They walked back toward the church side by side, close but not touching, each lost in private thoughts. Neither noticed the military police jeep that had just entered the town square, carrying officers from the Counterintelligence Corps who were beginning their systematic search for regime officials in hiding. The morning passed in a blur of activity as the medical unit prepared to move out. Aldridge was supervising the inventory and transfer of supplies when he heard raised voices from the church office that had been converted into an administrative area. He recognized one voice as Captain Reynolds. The other belonged to a counterintelligence officer. "She's been essential to our operation here," Reynolds was saying heatedly. "Treated dozens of our men." "That may be, Captain," the other voice replied coldly. "But we have her name on a list. University Hospital in Munich was a hotbed for party activity. All staff were required to join." "That's circumstantial at best. We have protocols to follow. She'll be detained and questioned like the others." Aldridge felt his stomach tighten. He glanced around the church but didn't see Elizabeth anywhere. The last he'd seen her, she'd been changing her grandfather's bandages. Moving quickly, he checked the patient area. Elizabeth's grandfather was sleeping peacefully, his fever reduced, but there was no sign of his granddaughter. A cold feeling of certainty settled over Aldridge. Elizabeth had heard about the counterintelligence officers or seen them arrive, and she had disappeared. For the rest of that day, as the medical unit packed up and prepared to move east, Aldridge searched for Elizabeth whenever he could slip away. He checked the church basement, the garden, nearby houses where she might have sought refuge. He asked the remaining patients, but none had seen her leave. It was as if she had simply vanished. At dusk, with the convoy ready to depart, Captain Reynolds found Aldridge still searching the narrow streets around the church. "We're rolling out in 10 minutes, Sergeant," he said, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Time to go." "She wouldn't just leave," Aldridge insisted. "Not without saying goodbye, and her grandfather is still here." Reynolds sighed. Maybe she was scared. The CIC has been asking a lot of questions. "I tried to vouch for her, but you know how they are. Bureaucracy and regulations." Aldridge looked out over the darkening town, frustration and worry gnawing at him. "Something's not right, Captain." "There's a lot not right in this whole damn war," Reynolds replied. "But we have our orders." Reluctantly, Aldridge gathered his belongings and climbed aboard the medical truck that would take him away from Eisenbach. As the convoy rumbled through the town gates, he looked back at the church spire silhouetted against the twilight sky, unable to shake the feeling that he was leaving something important unfinished. What he didn't know then, what he couldn't have known, was that Elizabeth Hoffman had indeed fled, but not out of fear for herself. She had recognized one of the counterintelligence officers as he entered the church, Lieutenant Walter Brenner, a man she had last seen in Munich 3 years earlier, wearing a very different uniform, a man who had reasons of his own to ensure that certain nurses from University Hospital never told their stories. Elizabeth had slipped away not to escape American justice, but to protect herself from something far more personal and dangerous. And she had taken with her a secret that would remain buried for 3 long years, until a chance encounter would bring Sergeant Thomas Aldridge back into her life under circumstances neither could have imagined. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the war in Europe ended officially with German surrender. Aldridge's medical unit continued to serve during the initial occupation, treating displaced persons and prisoners of war being released from camps throughout the region. He found himself stationed in Munich by the fall, working in a converted school building that now served as a medical center for American forces and the local population. Every day he treated dozens of patients, former soldiers, civilians, children suffering from malnutrition, and every day he found himself looking for a familiar face among the crowd. Though he never spoke of this to anyone, the brief, intense connection he had formed with Elizabeth Hoffman in that church in Eisenbach had left a mark on him that he couldn't explain even to himself. His tour of duty was extended twice as the massive task of rebuilding Europe got underway. The Counterintelligence Corps continued its work, processing thousands of Germans with connections to the former regime. Aldridge made discreet inquiries about Elizabeth several times, but her name never appeared in any records. It was as though she had never existed at all. In the spring of 1946, Sergeant Thomas Aldridge was honorably discharged from the United States Army. He returned to Baltimore with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and memories he rarely shared. He resumed his career as a pharmacist, eventually opening his own small store in a quiet neighborhood near the harbor. He dated occasionally, but never seriously. Friends and family attributed his reserve to his war experiences, and in time, they stopped asking questions about those years. But in his desk drawer, Aldridge kept a small photo that an army photographer had taken in Eisenbach, a group shot of the medical team standing outside the church aid station. In it, a young German nurse stood slightly apart from the others, her expression serious, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded him, Aldridge would take out the photo and wonder what had happened to Elizabeth Hoffman, the nurse who had disappeared before he could properly say goodbye. He had no way of knowing that 3,000 miles away, in a small apartment above a bakery in Berchtesgaden, she kept a similar photograph, and that their paths were destined to cross again in ways neither could imagine. June 16th, 1948. Baltimore sweltered under an unseasonable heat wave as Thomas Aldridge restocked the shelves of his pharmacy on East Monument Street. The afternoon sun streamed through the front window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. The small electric fan on the counter did little to dispel the heat, merely pushing the warm air around the narrow shop. Business had been slow that day. Most people were staying indoors or seeking relief at the harbor, where the water provided at least the illusion of coolness. 3 years had passed since Aldridge had returned from Europe. 3 years of rebuilding a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. The pharmacy was doing well enough. He had a modest apartment 8 blocks away, a circle of friends who gathered for cards every other Thursday, and a routine that provided structure, if not excitement. But there remained a restlessness in him, a sense of something unfinished that he couldn't quite name. The bell above the door jingled, and Aldridge looked up from his inventory clipboard. A woman entered, momentarily silhouetted against the bright street beyond. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small handbag. As she stepped into the shop, the light caught her blonde hair, pulled back in a neat bun with a few strands escaping around her face. "Good afternoon," Aldridge began with his customary greeting. "How can I—" The words died in his throat as recognition dawned. For a moment, he wondered if the heat had finally overcome him, causing hallucinations. "Hello, Thomas," said Elizabeth Hoffman. She looked both the same and different, the same clear blue eyes, the same graceful posture that had impressed him in the chaotic aid station of Eisenbach. But there was a new confidence in her bearing, and the haunted look that had shadowed her expression during the war had diminished, if not completely disappeared. "Elizabeth," he managed finally, setting down his clipboard with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. What are you doing in Baltimore?" She smiled, a small, cautious gesture. "I have been in America for 6 months, working at Johns Hopkins, as it happens." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the hospital. "Your recommendation letter was very helpful." Aldridge blinked in confusion. "My letter? But I never sent." "The one you gave me in Eisenbach," she clarified. "I kept it safe. For a long time I thought I would never use it, but circumstances change." 1,000 questions crowded Aldridge's mind, but before he could voice any of them, the door jingled again and a regular customer entered. Mrs. Pembroke, an elderly widow who came in every Wednesday for her heart medication. "Oh my, it's like an oven out there." Mrs. Pembroke fanned herself as she approached the counter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Aldridge, and to you, miss," she added, with a nod toward Elizabeth. Aldridge handled Mrs. Pembroke's prescription automatically, his mind still reeling from Elizabeth's unexpected appearance. When the elderly woman had finally departed, after her usual detailed update on her garden and her cat's digestive troubles, Elizabeth was still there, examining a display of sunburn remedies with apparent interest. "My shift ends at 5, Aldridge said, glancing at the clock. Could we talk then? There's a diner around the corner." Elizabeth nodded. "I would like that." "I will return at 5. She left as quietly as she had arrived, the bell announcing her departure with the same cheerful jingle it gave all customers. Aldridge stood motionless behind the counter, wondering if he had imagined the entire encounter. Only the lingering scent of her perfume, something light and floral that hadn't been part of her presence in wartime Germany, convinced him that Elizabeth Hoffman had really stood in his pharmacy in Baltimore, 3 years and an ocean away from where he had last seen her. The remaining hours of his workday passed with excruciating slowness. Aldridge checked the clock so frequently that his assistant, a pharmacy student named Paul, finally asked if he had somewhere important to be. "An old friend," Aldridge replied, surprised at how inadequate the word sounded. Elizabeth was more than a friend, less than. Well, he wasn't sure what she was. A ghost from his past, certainly. A question that had haunted him for 3 years. At precisely 5 o'clock, as Aldridge was locking the pharmacy door, Elizabeth appeared at his side. Up close in the early evening light, he could see fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a certain weariness beneath her composed exterior. "There is a park across the street," she said, nodding toward a small green space with benches along a footpath. "Perhaps that would be better than a diner, more private." Aldridge agreed, and they crossed the street together, maintaining a careful distance between them. The park was nearly empty, most people still hiding from the heat in air-conditioned buildings or at home with their electric fans. They found a bench beneath the spreading branches of an old oak tree, where the late afternoon sun dappled the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. For a long moment, neither spoke. 3 years of questions and imaginings had created a gulf between them that was suddenly difficult to bridge. "You disappeared," Aldridge said finally, "in Eisenbach. One moment you were there, the next, Elizabeth smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. I had to leave quickly. There was a man with the counterintelligence team, Lieutenant Walter Brenner. I knew him from Munich. The name meant nothing to Aldridge. One of the CIC officers. She nodded. Yes, but before that, he was something else. Something worse. Her hands tensed in her lap, the knuckles whitening briefly before she consciously relaxed them. Walter Brenner was Gestapo in Munich. He was involved in identifying undesirables, including at the hospital where I worked. After Germany began losing the war, many like him found ways to reposition themselves to appear valuable to the Allies. Aldridge felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach despite the heat of the day. And he recognized you in Eisenbach. I saw him first. Thankfully, I knew if he saw me there would be complications. Questions about what I knew, about what I had seen in Munich. She met Aldridge's gaze directly. I was not a party member, Thomas. I never believed in those things. But to work at the university hospital, one had to. Accommodate, look away sometimes, pretend not to see things. Like what happened to your friend Ruth, Aldridge said softly, remembering their conversation about the watch. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. You remember that? I remember everything about those days, he admitted. Then, wanting to shift away from what was clearly a painful topic, he asked, What happened to your grandfather after you left? A shadow crossed her face. He died 2 weeks later. The American medics took good care of him until the end. Captain Reynolds wrote to tell me. Seeing his surprise, she added, I had a cousin in Garmisch. I went there first. Your captain was kind enough to send word when my grandfather passed. Reynolds knew where you were all this time? Elizabeth shook her head. Only for a few months. After that I moved several times. Austria, Switzerland for a while. Then France, where I worked at a displaced persons camp. Until this. She gestured to encompass Baltimore, America, her present circumstances. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but huge gaps remained. And Brenner, the former Gestapo officer. He was exposed eventually. Another German recognized him and came forward. I heard he was sent to prison, though I don't know for certain. She paused. By then I was already in France. A warm breeze rustled the leaves above them, sending new patterns of light and shadow dancing across the ground. In the distance, children laughed as they played despite the heat, their voices carrying across the park. And now you're at Johns Hopkins, Aldridge said, still trying to absorb the reality of her presence in Baltimore. Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile he had seen from her. I am, working in the pediatric ward. They were impressed with my experience, especially in emergency care. The letter you wrote about my work in Eisenbach was persuasive. I'm glad, Aldridge said, returning her smile, though I'm still surprised you kept it all this time. Her expression grew thoughtful. It was a reminder that even in the worst times, there can be kindness, that not everyone sees an enemy when they look at someone from the other side. She hesitated. I almost contacted you when I first arrived in Baltimore, but I wasn't sure if you would want to be reminded of that time. Many people prefer to forget the war. Not me, Aldridge said with unexpected firmness. I mean, there are parts I'd like to forget, certainly, but not Eisenbach, not the church aid station. Not you, he thought, but didn't say. They talked for hours as the evening deepened around them, filling in the gaps of the 3 years that had passed since they had last seen each other. Elizabeth spoke of her journey through post-war Europe, the difficulties of being a German in displaced persons camps, the suspicion she had faced, the gradual rebuilding of her professional life. Aldridge told her about readjusting to civilian life in Baltimore, the challenges of starting his pharmacy business, the nightmares that had gradually become less frequent. It was nearly 10 o'clock when they finally rose from the bench, both surprised at how quickly time had passed. The streetlights had come on, casting pools of yellow light along the park paths. The evening had brought little relief from the heat, and the air remained heavy with humidity. May I walk you home? Aldridge offered. Elizabeth hesitated. I live near the hospital. It's quite a distance. I don't mind, he said. Then, more boldly than he would have thought possible hours earlier, I've waited 3 years to finish our conversation. What's a few more miles? She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but perhaps we could take the streetcar part of the way. My feet aren't as accustomed to American shoes as I'd like." They caught the last streetcar heading north, sitting side by side on the wooden bench seat as the vehicle clattered through the darkened streets of Baltimore. The few other passengers paid them little attention. A man and a woman heading home at the end of a long day, an unremarkable sight. "There's something I don't understand," Aldridge said as they neared the hospital district. "Why did you come to my pharmacy today? How did you even know where to find me?" Elizabeth looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I asked at Johns Hopkins if anyone knew of a Thomas Aldridge who had served as a medic in Europe. A doctor there remembered you from before the war, Dr. Brennan. He mentioned you had opened a pharmacy on East Monument Street." "James Brennan." Aldridge nodded. "We studied together at Maryland. But that doesn't answer why, Elizabeth. After 3 years, why now?" The streetcar lurched to a stop at their destination, temporarily postponing her answer. They descended to the sidewalk and began walking east toward the residential area where many of the hospital staff lived. "I saw someone yesterday," Elizabeth finally said, as they turned onto a tree-lined street of modest apartment buildings. "At the hospital, a patient being treated for a heart condition." Aldridge waited, sensing there was more to the story. "It was Lieutenant Brenner," she continued, her voice dropping to near a whisper. "Walter Brenner, the Gestapo officer from Munich who became a counterintelligence officer. He's here in Baltimore." Aldridge stopped walking, stunned. "That's impossible. You said he was in prison." "I said I heard he was sent to prison. Apparently he was released, or perhaps he was never imprisoned at all." Her expression was grim in the dim light from the street lamps. "There were many like him, Thomas, former regime officials who had skills the Allies found useful. Some were recruited to help identify others who were in hiding." "And now he's here in Baltimore?" Aldridge struggled to make sense of this revelation. "Why would he come to America?" Elizabeth resumed walking, more quickly now. "Operation Paperclip," she said. "The American program to bring German scientists and specialists to the United States. It's not just rocket scientists and doctors. There are others, intelligence officers, security personnel." Aldridge had heard rumors of such programs, but had paid little attention to them. His focus since returning home had been on rebuilding his own life, not following international politics. "And you think Brenner came over through this program?" "I don't know for certain, but seeing him there in the hospital. I panicked. I thought perhaps he had seen me too." She stopped in front of a 4-story brick apartment building. "This is where I live." Aldridge looked up at the building, then back at Elizabeth, concern evident in his expression. "If Brenner is as dangerous as you say, and if he recognized you—" "That's why I came to find you," she admitted. "I don't know who else to trust in this city. I have colleagues at the hospital, but no real friends yet. No one who would understand about it before." The implication of her words sank in slowly. She had come to him for help, for protection perhaps. The Elizabeth he had known in Eisenbach had been fiercely independent despite the circumstances, caring for others with quiet determination. That she would seek him out now spoke volumes about her level of concern. "Come to the pharmacy tomorrow," he said. "We'll figure this out together." Elizabeth nodded, relief evident in the loosening of her shoulders. "Thank you, Thomas." An awkward moment followed as neither seemed to know the proper way to say goodnight after such an unusual reunion. Finally, Elizabeth extended her hand. Aldridge took it, noting how different it felt from the last time they had touched. No longer chapped from harsh soap and constant washing in the aid station, but soft and warm in the summer night. "Until tomorrow," she said, withdrawing her hand and turning toward the building entrance. Aldridge watched until she was safely inside, then began the long walk back to the streetcar stop. His mind raced with questions and concerns. If Walter Brenner was indeed in Baltimore, and if he was the threat Elizabeth believed him to be, what could they do? Go to the authorities? But if Brenner had come to America through official channels, he might have protectors in the government. The thought of Elizabeth living in fear, looking over her shoulder in what should have been her new start, filled Aldridge with a determination he hadn't felt since the war. By the time he reached his own apartment, it was past midnight. Despite the late hour and the emotional turbulence of the day, sleep eluded him. He sat by his window, looking out at the quiet street below, thinking about the extraordinary twist of fate that had brought Elizabeth Hoffman back into his life. Whatever happened next, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not let her face it alone. The following morning, Aldridge opened the pharmacy earlier than usual, unable to stay in his apartment with so many unanswered questions crowding his mind. He had spent part of the night making lists of people who might be able to help, of possible courses of action, of things he needed to learn about Operation Paperclip and the status of former regime officials in America. His military service had taught him that preparation was critical in uncertain situations. Paul, his assistant, commented on his distracted manner when he arrived for his shift. "Everything okay, Mr. Aldridge? You seem a million miles away today." "Just thinking about an old friend," Aldridge replied, the same inadequate explanation he had offered the day before. "Listen, Paul, I may need to step out for a while this afternoon. Can you handle things here?" Paul assured him that he could, and Aldridge returned to his inventory, though he found it difficult to focus on counting bottles of aspirin and cough syrup. His eyes kept drifting to the clock and then to the door, watching for Elizabeth. She arrived just after the lunch rush, wearing a different dress than the day before, green with a small white collar, but with the same neat bun and composed expression. Only the slight shadows under her eyes suggested that her night had been as restless as his own. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice, though he had no logical reason to think she wouldn't. "Of course," she replied with a small smile. "Though I've been wondering all morning if I'm being foolish. Perhaps seeing Brenner has made me paranoid. He might not have recognized me at all." Aldridge gestured toward the back room. "Let's talk in my office." The office was little more than a storage room with a desk wedged into one corner, but it offered privacy from customers and from Paul, who was busy reorganizing the front display. Elizabeth sat in the single visitor's chair, while Aldridge leaned against the edge of his desk. "I've been thinking," he began. "We need more information about Brenner's status here, why he's in Baltimore, who he's working for, whether he has any official protection." He pulled a notepad from his desk drawer. "I made some calls this morning. I have a friend from the war who works at the Veterans Administration now. He's going to make some discreet inquiries." Elizabeth looked surprised. "You've done all this already?" Aldridge shrugged. "It seemed prudent to start immediately. If Brenner is a threat to you, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. And if he is here officially, with government approval." It was a question Aldridge had been considering himself. "Then we need to determine whether his past in Munich, his real past, is known to his current employers. If not, that could be leverage." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. "Leverage? You mean blackmail?" "I mean ensuring that the right people have all the facts," Aldridge clarified. "If Brenner misrepresented his activities during the war to secure a position here, that's information his superiors should have." They spent the next hour outlining what they knew and what they needed to find out. Elizabeth provided details about Brenner's activities in Munich, as far as she was aware of them. His role in identifying hospital staff and patients who were deemed undesirable by the regime, his involvement in deportations, his sudden disappearance shortly before the Americans arrived. Aldridge took careful notes, asking clarifying questions when needed. "There's one thing I don't understand," he said finally, setting down his pencil. "If Brenner was as involved as you say, why wasn't he arrested immediately after the war? Why would the Americans recruit him for counterintelligence?" Elizabeth's expression grew distant. Many former officials claimed they were just following orders, or that they had secretly opposed the regime's policies. Some had skills or knowledge that the Allies valued, information about Soviet activities, for instance, and record-keeping was chaotic during the final months. Many documents were lost or destroyed. "Convenient for men like Brenner," Aldridge observed grimly. "Yes," Elizabeth's hands twisted together in her lap. "That's why seeing him here was so disturbing. In Germany, at least he was a known quantity. Here he's remade himself again. Who knows what he's telling people about his past?" The bell from the front of the store interrupted their conversation, a customer needing Paul's assistance. Aldridge glanced at his watch, surprised to see how much time had passed. "I should get back to work," he said reluctantly. But we're not finished with this. Can you meet me tonight? There's someone I think we should talk to. Elizabeth nodded. I'm not on duty at the hospital until tomorrow morning. Good. I'll pick you up at 7. Wear something nice. We're going to dinner at the Chesapeake. Her eyes widened. The Chesapeake. Thomas, that's the most expensive restaurant in Baltimore. Aldridge smiled. We're not going for the food. We're going for the company. Senator Wilson dines there every Tuesday with his staff. And before he was Senator Wilson, he was Colonel Wilson of Army Intelligence. If anyone can tell us about Operation Paperclip and men like Brenner, it's him. That evening found Aldridge standing nervously outside Elizabeth's apartment building, wearing his best suit and feeling distinctly out of place. The Chesapeake was well beyond his usual budget, but the opportunity to speak with Senator Wilson was worth the expense. He had never met the senator personally, but he had treated the man's nephew in the field hospital during the push into Germany. It was a tenuous connection at best, but Aldridge hoped it would be enough to secure a few minutes of conversation. Elizabeth emerged from the building wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her blonde hair arranged in soft waves rather than her usual practical bun. For a moment, Aldridge forgot about Brenner, about the danger, about everything except how the evening light caught in her hair. "You look," he began, then faltered uncharacteristically at a loss for words. She smiled, the most genuine smile he had seen from her yet. "Thank you. So do you." The taxi ride to the Chesapeake passed in comfortable silence, both lost in thought about the evening ahead. The restaurant itself was as grand as its reputation suggested. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, waiters in formal attire moving discreetly between tables. The maitre d' raised an eyebrow at Aldridge's name, clearly finding no reservation, but a generous tip secured them a table near the back of the dining room, where Senator Wilson held court at his regular table, surrounded by aides and associates. "Now what?" Elizabeth asked quietly, after they had ordered. "Do we simply approach his table?" Aldridge shook his head. "We wait. The senator usually takes a brief walk around the dining room after his meal, greeting constituents. That's when I'll speak to him." Their own dinner arrived, an elaborate affair of multiple courses that Elizabeth barely touched and Aldridge consumed mechanically, his attention focused on the senator's table. Finally, as coffee was being served, Wilson rose and began his customary circuit of the restaurant, stopping to shake hands and exchange pleasantries with other diners. "Ready?" Aldridge asked as the senator approached their section. Elizabeth nodded, though her face had gone pale. "Ready." Aldridge stood as Wilson neared their table, extending his hand. "Senator Wilson, Sergeant Thomas Aldridge, 114th Medical Battalion. I treated your nephew near Kassel in '45. Wilson, a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair and penetrating grey eyes, paused. "Aldridge?" "Yes, I remember the name. Edward spoke highly of you in his letters home." He shook Aldridge's hand firmly. "What brings you to the Chesapeake tonight? Celebrating something special?" His gaze shifted to Elizabeth with polite interest. "In a manner of speaking, Senator, may I introduce Elizabeth Hoffman? She's a nurse at Johns Hopkins, recently arrived from Europe." Wilson nodded to Elizabeth. "A pleasure, Miss Hoffman. From Germany, I presume, from your accent." "Yes, Senator," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension Aldridge could see in her shoulders. "I worked at University Hospital in Munich before the war." Something flickered in Wilson's eyes, a subtle sharpening of attention. "Munich. Interesting. Well, I won't intrude on your evening further." "Actually, Senator," Aldridge said quickly, "we were hoping to speak with you briefly about a matter of some importance, regarding Operation Paperclip and a certain former German official now in Baltimore." Wilson's expression hardened. "This is hardly the venue for such a discussion, Mr. Aldridge. I understand, sir, but it concerns potential misrepresentation by someone who may have concealed their actual role during the war. Someone Miss Hoffman encountered in Munich in a capacity very different from the one he now claims." The senator studied them for a long moment, his political smile never wavering, though his eyes had grown cold. Finally, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card. "My office tomorrow morning at 9. Ask for Davis, my chief of staff. He'll give you 15 minutes. He handed the card to Aldridge. "Now, if you'll excuse me." As Wilson moved on to the next table, Aldridge released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That went better than I expected," he murmured to Elizabeth. "Did it?" she replied, her voice tight. He seemed displeased. "He's a politician. They never like surprises." Aldridge tucked the card carefully into his wallet. "But he's giving us a hearing. That's what matters." They finished their coffee in thoughtful silence, each contemplating what they would say in the 15 minutes Senator Wilson had granted them. As they left the restaurant, the summer night had cooled slightly, bringing a gentle breeze from the harbor that carried the scent of salt water and distant ships. "Would you like to walk for a while?" Aldridge suggested, reluctant to end the evening despite the tension of their upcoming meeting with the senator. Elizabeth nodded, and they strolled along the waterfront, watching the lights of boats moving across the dark water. After several minutes of companionable silence, she spoke. "Thank you, Thomas, for believing me, for helping me." "You would have done the same for me," he replied simply. "You did do the same in Eisenbach." She smiled at that. "I suppose I did, though the circumstances were quite different." "Not so different," Aldridge mused. "We were strangers from opposite sides who chose to see each other as people first. That's rare enough in peace, let alone war." They had reached a small park overlooking the harbor. Elizabeth paused, turning to face him directly. "Whatever happens tomorrow with the senator, I want you to know that finding you again has been significant to me. More than I expected." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Aldridge felt his heart quicken as he recognized the moment for what it was, a bridge being extended across the gulf of years and experiences that separated them. "For me as well," he replied softly. Then, gathering his courage, "Elizabeth, when this business with Brenner is resolved, would you consider, that is, I'd like to take you to dinner again, not to meet a senator, just dinner." Her smile in the moonlight was answer enough. The following morning found them in Senator Wilson's office on the 6th floor of a government building downtown. The waiting room was austere but elegant, with polished wooden furniture and framed photographs of Wilson with various dignitaries lining the walls. Davis, the chief of staff, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who regarded them with barely concealed impatience as he ushered them into the senator's private office. Wilson himself sat behind a massive desk, looking considerably less affable than he had in the restaurant. 15 minutes, Mr. Aldridge. The clock is ticking." Aldridge nodded, taking the seat indicated while Elizabeth sat beside him. "Thank you for seeing us, Senator. As I mentioned last night, we're concerned about an individual who came to the United States under Operation Paperclip, possibly by misrepresenting his activities during the war." Wilson's expression remained impassive. "And this individual is?" "Walter Brenner," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "Currently a patient at Johns Hopkins, where I work as a nurse. In Munich, before the American arrival, he was Gestapo." If Wilson was surprised by this information, he didn't show it. "Many Germans held various positions during the war, Miss Hoffman. The nature of defeat and occupation often necessitates flexibility in employment." "This wasn't simply a change in employment," Elizabeth countered, color rising in her cheeks. "Brenner was responsible for identifying staff and patients at University Hospital for deportation to the camps. He personally ordered the arrest of Dr. Weiss, the chief of surgery, and his entire family. None returned." Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying her with narrowed eyes. "Those are serious accusations. Do you have documentation? Witnesses?" "I witnessed it," Elizabeth said firmly, "as did many others at the hospital, and there would be records in Munich if they weren't destroyed during the retreat." The senator's gaze shifted to Aldridge. "And your interest in this matter, Mr. Aldridge, beyond your obvious personal concern for Miss Hoffman?" Aldridge straightened in his chair. "When I served in Bavaria, Senator, I believed we were fighting for certain principles. Justice was one of them. If Walter Brenner has come to America under false pretenses, concealing crimes against innocent people, that matters to me as a veteran and as a citizen." For several long moments, Wilson was silent, drumming his fingers lightly on the polished surface of his desk. Finally, he pressed a button on his intercom. "Davis, bring me the Brenner file." The Chief of Staff appeared moments later with a thin manila folder, which he placed on the desk, before retreating from the office. Wilson opened it, scanning its contents with an unreadable expression. "Walter Brenner," he said finally, still looking at the file. "Age 42. Former counterintelligence officer recruited in May of 45. Specialist in identifying regime officials in hiding." He looked up at Elizabeth. "No mention here of any Gestapo affiliation." "He wouldn't have included that in his background," she said, "but it's the truth." Wilson closed the file. "Miss Hoffman, I appreciate your coming forward with this information. Rest assured it will be thoroughly investigated." He stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "My office will be in touch if we require any further details." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. As they rose to leave, Aldridge couldn't shake the feeling that they had somehow failed, that the senator's assurances were merely political courtesy rather than a commitment to action. "Senator," he said, lingering at the door while Elizabeth stepped into the waiting room, "my father always said you can judge a nation by how it holds the powerful accountable, not just the powerless." Wilson's expression softened slightly. "Your father sounds like a wise man, Mr. Aldridge. Good day." Outside on the street, the summer heat had returned in full force. Elizabeth looked dejected as they walked back toward the center of town. "He didn't believe me," she said. "Or if he did, he doesn't care." "Maybe," Aldridge conceded. "Or maybe he needs to verify your information before taking action. Men in his position have to be careful about accusations." Elizabeth shook her head. "You don't understand how these things work, Thomas. Men like Brenner protect each other. They've been doing it since the war ended, changing identities, obscuring records, creating new histories for themselves." They stopped at a small cafe for coffee, sitting at an outdoor table beneath a striped awning that offered some relief from the sun. Aldridge watched as Elizabeth stirred her coffee absently, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "What now?" she asked finally. Aldridge considered the question carefully. "We've done what we can through official channels. If Wilson investigates, good. If not—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the alternative. "If not, Brenner remains free to reinvent himself yet again," Elizabeth finished for him. "To pretend he was never involved in sending innocent people to their deaths. To live a comfortable life in America, while those who survived what he did continue to suffer." The bitterness in her voice caught Aldridge by surprise. In all their interactions, both during the war and since her unexpected appearance in his pharmacy, Elizabeth had maintained a certain composure, a dignity that seemed to rise above the circumstances. Now, for the first time, he glimpsed the depth of pain and anger beneath that careful exterior. "There's something you haven't told me," he said quietly. "Something personal about Brenner." Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "My friend Ruth," she said, her voice barely audible over the street noise. "The one I told you about in Eisenbach, the one who wore a watch like the German soldiers." She drew a deep breath. "She was more than my friend, Thomas. She was my sister, my half-sister from my father's first marriage. We grew up together, studied nursing together." Aldridge felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. "And Brenner?" "Ordered her arrest. I was on duty when they came for her. He knew we were sisters. It was in our records at the hospital. He looked me in the eye as they took her away and said, 'Be grateful we're not taking you too.' 3 days later, he returned and offered to help me if I would, cooperate with his department, provide information on patients and staff." "Did you?" Aldridge asked gently. Elizabeth's eyes flashed. "Never. I requested a transfer to a field hospital immediately. That's how I eventually ended up in Eisenbach, caring for my grandfather after he was injured in an air raid." She looked away. "I never saw Ruth again." The full weight of Elizabeth's story settled over them, casting a shadow that even the bright summer sun couldn't dispel. Aldridge reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture of comfort that seemed wholly inadequate against such a loss. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing how empty the words must sound. "I didn't understand before, the full extent of it. Elizabeth squeezed his hand briefly before withdrawing hers. Few people do, that's part of the problem. The world wants to move forward, to rebuild and forget. But some things should not be forgotten. She straightened her shoulders with visible effort. That's why seeing Brenner here in America, living freely while pretending to be someone else, I couldn't bear it. As they sat there in the midday heat, a plan began to form in Aldridge's mind. Not a perfect solution, but perhaps the only one available to them if official channels failed. Elizabeth, he began cautiously, what if there was another way to ensure Brenner faces consequences, not through government action but through exposure? Her expression grew wary. What do you mean? I have a friend at the Baltimore Sun. If we gathered enough evidence, your testimony, perhaps statements from others who worked at the hospital in Munich, any documentation that might still exist, we could take the story public. Force the authorities to investigate by creating pressure they couldn't ignore. Elizabeth considered this, her expression thoughtful. It would be risky, for both of us. Yes, Aldridge acknowledged, but sometimes the right path isn't the safest one. 3 days later, as Elizabeth finished her morning shift at Johns Hopkins, she was summoned to the administrative office. There she found a serious-faced man in a dark suit who introduced himself only as Mr. Clark from the State Department. Miss Hoffman, he said without preamble, I understand you've been making inquiries about one of our patients, Walter Brenner. Elizabeth felt her heart race but kept her expression neutral. I recognized him from Munich. I worked at the same hospital before the war. Clark nodded. So I understand. Mr. Brenner was discharged yesterday and transferred to Washington for extended debriefing. Senator Wilson thought you should know. The carefully neutral phrasing couldn't disguise the significance of this development. Elizabeth stared at Clark, scarcely daring to hope. Debriefing about what exactly? That's classified information, Miss Hoffman. Clark's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened slightly. Let's just say that certain inconsistencies in Mr. Brenner's background have come to light. Senator Wilson takes such matters very seriously. After Clark departed, Elizabeth stood motionless in the administrative office, processing what had just occurred. Then, without bothering to change out of her uniform, she rushed to the pharmacy on East Monument Street. Aldridge was assisting an elderly customer when she burst through the door. Seeing her expression, he quickly finished the transaction and turned to her expectantly. Brenner's gone, Elizabeth said breathlessly. Taken to Washington for debriefing, a State Department man came to tell me. Aldridge's face broke into a wide smile. Wilson came through. It appears so, Elizabeth agreed, still sounding somewhat stunned. I didn't think he would. I thought that no one would care about justice after all this time. Aldridge guided her to a chair behind the counter. Some people still do, Elizabeth. Not everyone wants to simply move on without accountability. That evening, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at Aldridge's apartment. Nothing as grand as the Chesapeake, but somehow more meaningful. As they sat on his small balcony watching the sunset paint the Baltimore skyline in gold and crimson, Elizabeth turned to him with an expression he hadn't seen before, one of peace, perhaps even happiness. I've been thinking, she said, about what happens next. Aldridge raised an eyebrow. Regarding Brenner? No. She smiled. Regarding me. Us, perhaps. She looked out at the city spread below them. For 3 years I've been running from the past, moving from place to place, never allowing myself to think beyond survival. Even coming to Baltimore, using your letter to secure a position at Johns Hopkins, it was part of the same pattern, another temporary stop. And now? Aldridge asked, hardly daring to breathe. Now I think I might like to stay, to build something here. She met his gaze directly. If that's something you might want too. His answer was not in words, but in the way he reached for her hand, in the certainty of his touch, in the promise that passed between them as the last light of day faded, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. 3 years after their paths had crossed in a small Bavarian church, Thomas Aldridge and Elizabeth Hoffman had found each other again across an ocean and against impossible odds. The wounds of war would never fully heal, and the shadows of the past would never completely recede. But in that moment, as Baltimore lit up beneath them and the summer night embraced them in its warmth, they understood that some connections transcend time and circumstance, that some acts of compassion echo far beyond their original intent, and that sometimes, even in a world broken by conflict, healing is possible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.